My name is Dr. Elena Marchetti. I hold a doctorate in structural engineering from Politecnico di Milano, with a specialization in the restoration and reinforcement of historical architecture. I have worked on 16 sites classified by UNESCO, including the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, the Colosseum substructures, and portions of the Uffizi Gallery's foundation system. My curriculum includes peer-reviewed publications on load distribution in ancient masonry and seismic retrofitting of ecclesiastical buildings. I am telling you this not to boast, but to establish that I am not prone to exaggeration, superstition, or misinterpretation of technical data. In March 2019, I received a formal contract proposal from the Fabbrica di San Pietro, the administrative body responsible for the physical maintenance of St. Peter's Basilica. The letter was signed by Monsignor Giulio Tessari, then Director of Technical Operations, and countersigned by a representative of the Governorate of Vatican City-State. The engagement was described as a multi-phase assessment of structural integrity in the Hypogeum levels beneath the basilica, with particular attention to moisture infiltration, foundation settlement, and the adequacy of existing support columns installed during prior restorations in the 1940s and 1950s. The estimated duration was 18 months. Compensation was generous, but not unusual for a project of that scale and sensitivity. I signed the contract on April 2, 2019, and began work on April 15th. Access was granted through the Ufficio Tecnico, located in a nondescript administrative building behind the apse. I was issued a laminated badge with embedded RFID, a key card for restricted elevators, and a mobile phone configured to operate only within Vatican territory. My team consisted of 4 engineers, 2 geologists, a topographer, and a site coordinator provided by the Vatican. All of us had been vetted through background checks that included not only professional credentials but also, curiously, though I did not dwell on it at the time, baptismal records and declarations of religious affiliation. I remember thinking it was merely an administrative formality consistent with Vatican employment policy. The work itself was routine. We conducted laser scanning of vaulted ceilings, analyzed crack propagation in load-bearing walls, installed sensors to monitor differential settlement. I spent most of May drafting reports and reviewing archival drawings. It felt safe. It felt like every other restoration project I had supervised. That perception was the first and most significant error of my career. The underground levels beneath St. Peter's are extensive, historically complex, and tightly controlled. Public access is limited to the Vatican necropolis, the ancient Roman cemetery over which the basilica was constructed in the 4th century. Visitors descend through guided tours, passing the so-called Tomb of the Julii and other burial chambers decorated with early Christian mosaics. But those tours follow a prescribed route. The areas we worked in were deeper, older, and entirely off-limits to civilians. Our designated workspace was sub-level 3, approximately 9 meters below the basilica floor, accessible only by a service elevator near the sacristy. The elevator required 2 simultaneous keycards to operate, mine and that of the site coordinator, a man named Franco Amati, who had worked for the Fabbrica for 31 years. Franco was courteous, disciplined, and utterly uninterested in conversation. He arrived punctually every morning, unlocked the necessary doors, remained present during all site activities, and departed at the end of the workday. He never explained why he was there, and I never asked. Sub-level 3 was divided into corridors that followed the layout of the ancient Roman structures. The walls were a composite of original Roman brick, medieval stone reinforcement, and modern concrete injections. Climate control was managed by a dedicated HVAC system installed in the 1980s. Humidity was kept at 58%, temperature at 17 degrees Celsius. Lighting was fluorescent, mounted in protective cages. The air smelled of damp stone and machine oil. There were no windows, no natural light, and no indication that we were beneath one of the most visited sites on Earth. The silence was absolute except for the hum of ventilation fans. The protocols were rigid. No electronic devices capable of transmitting data. No smartphones. No tablets connected to external networks. No cameras except those logged and inspected by Franco. All measurements were recorded on physical forms, which were collected and archived daily by an administrative assistant who descended once per afternoon, usually around 4 o'clock. Each sheet bore a stamp. Proprietà della Santa Sede, riservato. We were not permitted to retain copies. At the time, I assumed this was standard procedure for sensitive heritage sites. I did not yet understand that the sensitivity had nothing to do with heritage preservation. Documentation of previous interventions was fragmentary. I requested access to structural drawings from the 1940s campaign, which I knew had included significant excavation and reinforcement work during World War II. I was told that many records had been lost during the war or damaged by flooding in the 1950s. What I was given instead were schematic floor plans with large sections labeled non accessibile or struttura consolidata, no intervento. I accepted the explanation. I should not have. On June 18, 2019, at approximately 10:45 in the morning, we were conducting a ground-penetrating radar survey in Corridor 7D, a narrow passageway aligned with the southern transept of the Basilica above. The purpose was to map subsurface voids that might indicate either uncharted burial chambers or structural weaknesses in the foundation matrix. The equipment we used was a GSSI SEER 4000 system with a 400 MHz antenna, standard for archaeological and engineering applications. The data was being recorded directly onto a ruggedized laptop operated by my colleague, Dr. Luca Morandi, a geophysicist with 12 years of field experience. At 10:47, the system detected an anomaly. The radar profile showed a void space approximately 3 meters below our current level, extending horizontally for at least 8 meters. The signal reflection pattern was inconsistent with any known structural feature. It was too regular to be a natural cavity, too deep to correspond with documented burial chambers, and oriented at an angle that suggested deliberate excavation rather than collapse or erosion. I instructed Luca to mark the location and run a second pass to confirm the data. As he repositioned the antenna, the laptop screen flickered. For approximately 4 seconds, the radar image was replaced by a different display. What appeared to be an architectural section drawing, rendered in a style consistent with early 20th century drafting techniques. It showed a rectangular chamber with a vaulted ceiling, accessed by a descending staircase, with annotations in German. Verschlossen, 1942, and Nicht öffnen. Then the screen returned to the normal radar interface. Luca looked at me. I looked at Franco, who was standing 3 meters behind us. His expression had not changed. I asked if the equipment had been used previously for other projects. Luca said it had been calibrated that morning and showed no errors during the diagnostic sequence. Franco said nothing. I asked him if he had seen the image on the screen. He said he had been looking at his tablet. I did not press further. I told Luca to save the data. He attempted to export the file to an external drive, but the system returned an error. File corrupted or incomplete. The radar profile from 1047 was no longer in the memory. We continued the survey. The anomaly appeared again on the next pass, in the same location, with the same dimensions. This time, no image appeared. I made a handwritten note of the coordinates and the depth measurement. Franco collected the survey log at the end of the day, as usual. I did not mention the image. I told myself it was a software glitch, a cached file from a previous project, a meaningless artifact of electronic interference. I knew, even then, that I was lying to myself. That evening, I remained in my temporary office in the Ufficio Tecnico building. It was a small room on the second floor, sparsely furnished. Desk, chair, filing cabinet, telephone with an internal Vatican line. I had been given a desktop computer with access to a limited intranet, primarily for submitting digital reports and accessing technical specifications. Internet access was restricted and logged. I could not stop thinking about the image on Luca's screen. I drafted a brief memorandum describing the radar anomaly and the brief appearance of the architectural drawing. I did not speculate. I did not draw conclusions. I simply documented what we had observed, with the date, time, and coordinates. I saved the file as Anomalia 7D 18062019, PDF, and printed 2 copies. I placed one in the outgoing document tray for submission to Monsignor Tessari. The second copy I folded and placed in my personal notebook. It was a small act of disobedience. I justified it as professional prudence, maintaining a personal record in case of future disputes over scope of work or contractual obligations. But that justification was incomplete. What I felt, sitting in that office under fluorescent lights while the rest of the Vatican descended into evening silence, was the beginning of suspicion. Not of anything supernatural, of something worse, institutional concealment. I also photographed the handwritten survey log from that morning, using my personal phone, which I had been required to leave in a locker during site access, but had retrieved after hours. The photograph was poor quality, but legible. I saved it to an encrypted cloud drive under a file name unrelated to the project. I told myself I would delete it later. I never did. 3 days later, I received a written request from Monsignor Tessari asking me to submit all documentation related to Corridor 7D, including preliminary observations, draft memos, and internal notes. The request was phrased courteously, citing administrative consolidation of survey records. I complied. I submitted the printed copy of my memorandum. I did not mention the second copy in my notebook, nor the photograph on my phone. Tessari thanked me in a brief email and said the matter was being reviewed by senior technical staff. He did not specify who they were or what they were reviewing. The following week, I attempted to access the Corridor 7D survey data through the internal database. The file had been moved to a restricted directory. When I inquired with the site coordinator, Franco told me that certain data required secondary verification before it could be reintegrated into the project archive. He did not say who was conducting the verification or when it would be completed. I asked if we would be returning to Corridor 7D to conduct follow-up analysis. He said that section had been removed from the active survey schedule. I asked why. He said it was an administrative decision. I did not ask again. On July 9, 2019, at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was summoned to a meeting in a building I had not previously entered, a 4-story structure adjacent to the Apostolic Palace, unmarked and accessible only through an interior courtyard. I was met at the entrance by a young priest in a black cassock who did not introduce himself. He escorted me to a 3rd-floor conference room furnished with a long table, 6 chairs, and a crucifix on the wall. No windows. A single door. Seated at the table was a man in his mid-60s, dressed in the black suit and pectoral cross of a cardinal, though he did not offer his name or title. To his right was a younger man in civilian clothing, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the Vatican coat of arms. The cardinal gestured for me to sit. He spoke in Italian with a Venetian accent, his tone cordial but entirely devoid of warmth. He thanked me for my work on the Basilica project. He said my reports had been thorough and professional. He then said that certain technical findings had raised questions that extended beyond the scope of structural engineering, and that the matter was now being handled by a different office within the governorate. He did not specify which office. He said that my continued access to Sub-Level 3 would be adjusted to exclude areas undergoing specialized review. He said this adjustment was temporary and procedural. I asked if the adjustment was related to the anomaly in Corridor 7D. He paused, glanced at the man beside him, and said that he could not discuss details of ongoing assessments. He said that Vatican policy required certain archaeological findings to be evaluated by committees with expertise in historical interpretation, and that engineering personnel were not always included in those evaluations. He used the word archaeological. He did not use the word structural. The man with the portfolio then opened it and removed a printed document, my memorandum from June 18th. He placed it on the table in front of me and asked if I had retained any other copies, drafts, or notes related to the incident described therein. I said I had not. It was the first time I consciously lied to a Vatican official. He nodded, returned the document to his portfolio, and said that all materials related to the matter had been consolidated for archival purposes, and that I should consider the issue closed from an operational standpoint. The Cardinal stood. He thanked me again. He said the church valued my professionalism and discretion. He said nothing about consequences. He did not need to. I understood perfectly. I left the building, returned to my office, and resumed work on other sections of the survey. I did not ask about Corridor 7D again, but I also did not delete the photograph from my cloud drive. Over the following weeks, I began to notice changes. Small, procedural, easily explained in isolation, but accumulating into a pattern I could no longer ignore. My access badge was reprogrammed. I was no longer able to enter the elevator to sub-level 3 unaccompanied. Franco now had to escort me from the ground floor, even for routine tasks I had previously performed independently. When I asked why the change had been implemented, I was told it was part of a general update to security protocols following an unrelated incident in a different Vatican building. I was not told what the incident was. Luca Morandi, the geophysicist who had been operating the radar system on June 18th, was reassigned. I was informed that he had requested a transfer to a different project due to family obligations. I later contacted him by phone. He told me he had been offered a contract extension conditional on his immediate reassignment and signature of a non-disclosure agreement. He did not tell me what the agreement covered. He sounded tired. He said he had a daughter in university and could not afford to decline the extension. He asked me not to call again. My desktop computer was replaced. The IT technician said the previous unit had shown signs of hardware degradation. The new computer had no access to the internal project archive. When I requested restoration of access, I was told that archival permissions were being restructured and that I would be notified when the process was complete. I was never notified. I began to see the same man in different locations. A middle-aged figure in a gray suit, unremarkable in appearance, standing near the entrance to the Ufficio Tecnico, seated in a car parked outside the Vatican post office, walking 30 meters behind me as I crossed St. Peter's Square. I could not prove he was following me. I could not prove he was not. One evening, I returned to my apartment in Prati, a residential neighborhood north of the Vatican. The door was locked as I had left it. Nothing appeared disturbed, but the papers on my desk, notes, sketches, printed emails, were arranged differently than I remembered. It was a subtle difference, easily attributed to my own forgetfulness. But I knew I was not forgetful. I began photographing the arrangement of objects before leaving each morning. The photographs confirmed, 3 days later, that someone had entered the apartment during my absence. I did not report the intrusion to Italian police. I understood with absolute clarity that this would accomplish nothing. I began carrying my notebook and phone with me at all times. I stopped using my apartment computer for any work-related communication. I started drafting messages on paper and disposing of them outside my building. I felt paranoid. I felt rational. Both were true. In late July, I was granted access to the Vatican Apostolic Archive for the purpose of reviewing historical records related to structural interventions in St. Peter's Basilica. The request had been submitted weeks earlier as part of the normal research process. The approval came through with no explanation for the delay and no restrictions on scope. The archive is housed in the Palazzo della Cancelleria, a Renaissance building several blocks from the Basilica. Access is controlled, requiring advance appointment and presentation of credentials. I was assigned a reading room on the second floor, supervised by a prefect who remained present throughout my visit. I requested files related to the 1940s excavation campaign, particularly engineering reports and correspondence from the Fabbrica di San Pietro during the period 1939 to 1945. What I received was incomplete. Many documents bore stamps indicating they had been transferred to restricted classifications. Archivio segreto, or accesso riservato. Others were missing pages, with no indication of removal or restriction. Some files contained only cover sheets and indices, the contents absent. I asked the prefect if additional material was available. He said I would need to submit a separate request specifying the exact document reference codes. I asked how I could specify codes for documents whose existence I could only infer from fragmentary indices. He said he could not advise me on research methodology. I did find one useful document, A memorandum dated April 12, 1943, written in German, from an engineer named Albrecht Kessler to Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, the German prelate who directed the excavation project during the war. The memo was brief, technical, and deeply strange. It described the discovery of a subterranean structure of non-Roman origin during tunneling operations beneath the southern transept. Kessler noted that the structure was sealed with stone blocks of unusual density, and that removal of the blocks had revealed an interior space inconsistent with known burial typologies. The memo ended with a recommendation that the chamber be resealed immediately and excluded from further excavation. A handwritten annotation in the margin, in Italian, read, Eseguito, L.K. I photographed the document with my phone, discreetly, while the prefect was consulting a catalog at the other end of the room. The image was clear. I saved it to my encrypted drive and continued reviewing files. I found no further references to Kessler, the chamber, or the 1943 discovery. It was as though the matter had been erased, leaving behind only this single, overlooked fragment. Before I left the archive, I asked the prefect if records related to wartime excavations were subject to special restrictions. He said that materials involving sensitive historical periods were often reviewed for declassification on a case-by-case basis. He said the process could take years. He did not say why it took years. I thanked him and left. In August, I began searching for Albrecht Kessler. I found very little. He appeared in a 1942 publication on Roman engineering, listed as a consulting engineer for Vatican construction projects. A brief biographical note identified him as Austrian, trained at the Technical University of Vienna, employed by the Vatican from 1941 to 1944. Beyond that, nothing. No obituary, no post-war employment records, no academic publications, no naturalization or emigration documents. His name appeared in 2 other archival references, both fragmentary, both dated to 1943. Then he vanished. I contacted an Austrian genealogical research service and requested a search of civil records. The response came 2 weeks later. Albrecht Kessler, born 1898 in Graz, last recorded address in Rome, 1944. No death certificate, no emigration record, no further documentation. The researcher noted that this was not uncommon for individuals caught in the chaos of the war's final years, but suggested I contact the International Tracing Service in Germany if I required more detailed investigation. I did not. I also searched for Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, who was far better documented. Kaas had been a prominent German prelate, a politician in the Weimar Republic, and a key figure in Vatican administration during the 1930s and 1940s. He directed the excavations beneath St. Peter's from 1939 until his death in 1952. His legacy is well known. He oversaw the identification of what the Church claims to be the tomb of St. Peter, a discovery that remains central to Vatican archaeology. But I found no mention, in any published history, of the 1943 chamber. I did find a reference in a 1951 letter from Kaas to a colleague, archived in a collection at the Pontifical Gregorian University. The letter was brief, personal, and included a single cryptic sentence. The matter beneath the south transept remains unresolved, and I have recommended it be left to Providence. No further explanation, no indication of what the matter was. The letter was dated 6 months before Kaas died. I considered reaching out to historians specializing in Vatican excavations. I did not. I understood by then that I was not engaged in academic research. I was engaged in something far more dangerous. I needed someone outside the institution, someone with no formal ties to the Church, someone who had already accepted the cost of asking prohibited questions. I needed Dr. Samuel Corey. I first encountered Corey's name in an article published in 2017 in the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, titled Suppressed Texts and Structural Silences, The Vatican's Policy on Pre-Nicene Discoveries. The article examined how the Church had historically managed archaeological findings that conflicted with established theological narratives. Corey was a Lebanese historian based in Beirut, with a doctorate from the Sorbonne and a reputation for meticulous, uncompromising scholarship. The article had been controversial but never retracted. I found his contact information through the university directory. I sent him an encrypted email in early September. I did not explain everything. I described myself as a structural engineer working on a Vatican restoration project, and said I had encountered documentation of a sealed chamber discovered in 1943, about which I could find no further records. I asked if he was familiar with wartime excavations beneath St. Peter's, and whether he knew of similar cases of suppressed findings. I did not mention the radar anomaly, the image on the screen, or the Cardinal's warning. I waited. Khoury responded 4 days later. He said he was familiar with the 1943 excavations and had, in fact, come across references to undocumented chambers in fragmentary Vatican correspondence he had reviewed years earlier. He said the Church had a long history of sealing archaeological sites deemed theologically problematic, and that wartime excavations were particularly sensitive due to their connection with fascist and Nazi interests in esoteric archaeology. He offered to share some of his research if I was willing to meet in person. He said he would be in Rome in October for a conference. I agreed. We met on October 14th in a cafe near Termini Station, far from Vatican City. Khoury was in his late 50s, thin, precise in speech, cautious in demeanor. He brought with him a folder of photocopied documents, including a digitized scan of a 1943 internal Vatican memorandum he had obtained from a former archivist who had worked in the Apostolic Archive in the 1980s. The memo was classified under the code Angelus sub terra, Angel beneath the earth. The memo described a chamber discovered during tunnel expansion beneath the southern transept. It noted the presence of a stone tablet with inscriptions in an unknown pre-Latin script, alongside symbols resembling astronomical or calendrical charts. The inscription had been partially translated by a Jesuit linguist, who identified the language as Proto-Aramaic. One phrase was complete and unambiguous: "The sky will close." The memo further noted that the chamber showed evidence of prolonged human occupation and that the structure had been deliberately sealed in antiquity. The final line read, "Material secured. Containment protocols initiated. No further excavation authorized." Khoury leaned back and looked at me. He said this was not the only such case. He had found similar references in documents related to excavations in Jerusalem, beneath Hagia Sophia, and under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, all sealed by ecclesiastical order. All described using the same administrative language: containment, not preservation. He said the Church was not hiding relics. It was hiding something else, something older, something that had been deliberately imprisoned. I showed him the photograph of Kessler's 1943 memo. Khoury studied it in silence. Then he said, "This is the same chamber." I asked him what he thought it meant. He said he didn't know, but that he intended to find out. He asked if I had access to the site. I said I had been removed from that section. He asked if I was being watched. I said I believed I was. He nodded and said, "Then you should stop asking questions, Dr. Marchetti. Or you should commit to seeing this through. There is no middle path." I chose to see it through. Khoury left Rome 2 days after our meeting. Before he departed, he gave me a second document, one he said he had never published, never shown to colleagues, and never uploaded to any digital system. He called it his insurance, though he did not specify against what. It was a photocopy of a 1948 letter, written in French, from Cardinal Eugène Tisserand to an unnamed recipient identified only as Eminence. Tisserand had been the Vatican's chief librarian and later dean of the College of Cardinals, a figure of immense influence. The letter was brief, formal, and chilling. It read, in part, "The matter of the Southern Chamber remains a source of grave concern. The entity, or entities, sealed therein were not placed by accident nor by superstition, but by deliberate theological necessity. The phrase inscribed, 'Le ciel se fermera,' is not prophecy. It is instruction. The architects of the seal understood what we have only begun to suspect, that certain truths, once released, cannot be contained. The decision to maintain the seal is not cowardice. It is obedience to a responsibility we did not choose, but cannot refuse. The letter continued with procedural notes. The chamber would remain under continuous observation. Access would be restricted to a rotating cadre of designated clergy, and any physical or seismic anomalies would be reported immediately to an oversight committee within the Secretariat of State. The letter ended. We are custodians, not discoverers. Our task is not revelation, but prevention. I read the letter 3 times. I asked Khoury where he had obtained it. He said it had been provided by a former Vatican archivist, now deceased, who had spent his final years in a hospice in France. The archivist had given Khoury a small cache of documents before his death, with a single instruction. These should not remain buried with me. Khoury had verified the authenticity of the handwriting and the paper composition. He believed it was genuine. So did I. I asked why he had not published it. He said, because the last 3 people who tried to publish material like this experienced consequences. One lost his position. One was hospitalized under suspicious circumstances. One died in a car accident that was ruled mechanical failure. He paused. I am careful, Dr. Marchetti, but I am also afraid. I understood then what I had entered. This was not an academic dispute. This was not bureaucratic obstruction. This was an apparatus of suppression that spanned centuries, continents, and institutional hierarchies. And I had walked into it without preparation, without protection, and without understanding the rules. Before Khoury left, he told me to be cautious, to document everything, and to trust no one employed by the Vatican. He also told me he would continue his research and would contact me if he found further evidence. I never heard from him again. 3 weeks after Khoury's departure, I received an anonymous email. The sender's address was a randomized string of characters, routed through an encrypted service. The subject line was blank. The message contained a single sentence. Search for Protocollo Silenzio, 1962-1978. I hesitated. I did not know who had sent it. I did not know if it was a trap. But I searched. I found nothing in public databases, nothing in academic literature, nothing in Vatican publications. I contacted a colleague in Milan who specialized in Cold War intelligence history. I asked, hypothetically, if he had ever encountered references to Vatican involvement in information suppression during the 1960s and 1970s. He said he had not, but that it would not surprise him. He said the Vatican had maintained informal intelligence relationships with multiple Western governments during that period, particularly regarding Eastern Bloc activities and communist infiltration of Catholic institutions. He said if such a protocol existed, it would likely be classified under diplomatic or national security pretexts, and would never appear in ecclesiastical archives. I tried a different approach. I contacted a journalist in Rome who had written extensively on Vatican financial scandals and institutional secrecy. I asked if he had heard of Protocollo Silenzio. He went silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Where did you hear that name?" I said I couldn't specify. He said, "Then I can't help you. But I will tell you this. Stop asking about it. People who ask about that do not publish their findings. They disappear from their positions, or they leave the country, or they have accidents." He ended the call. I was persistent. I submitted Freedom of Information requests to Italian government archives related to Vatican diplomatic correspondence. I received bureaucratic delays, incomplete responses, and eventual denials citing national security exemptions. I began searching for patterns in news archives: disappearances, accidents, resignations involving archaeologists, historians, or clergy who had worked on sensitive Vatican projects. I found 12 cases between 1962 and 1985 that fit the pattern. None had been investigated as connected incidents. All had been ruled accidental, natural, or unexplained. Then I received a second anonymous email. This one contained an attachment, a scanned page from what appeared to be a 1973 memorandum written in Italian, marked Riservato Solo Destinatario. The memo outlined procedures for coordinating with Italian intelligence services, SISMI, and unspecified allied agencies to monitor and, if necessary, administratively neutralize individuals engaged in unauthorized research related to archaeologically sensitive sites under Holy See jurisdiction. The memo did not name the sites. It did not need to. The message included one additional sentence. This is real. Be careful who you trust. I saved the file. I did not reply. I understood I was being warned, assisted, or both. I also understood I was now part of a structure I had not consented to join, a network of people who had seen too much, who had chosen not to forget, and who lived under the permanent threat of institutional retribution. In November 2019, I was contacted by a woman who identified herself only as M. She said she had worked in the Vatican Secretariat of State during the 1990s, and that she had left under circumstances she would not describe. She said she had heard I was asking questions about the Southern Chamber. She said she wanted to meet. We met in a public park in Trastevere. She was in her 60s, composed, careful in speech. She did not give me her full name. She did not explain how she had learned of my investigation. She simply handed me a USB drive and said, "This was kept in a safe I had access to. I copied it before I left. I have kept it for 24 years. I do not want to keep it any longer." The drive contained a single audio file, recorded on analog tape and digitized at some later point. The recording was poor quality, marred by static and background noise, but the voices were audible. The conversation was in Italian, dated by a voice timestamp at the beginning, 12 Maggio 1995, or 22 Forda. Two men were speaking. One voice was older, authoritative, speaking in measured tones. The other was younger, nervous, deferential. The older voice said, "The seismic readings have increased. The chamber is not stable. We need to assess whether the seal is degrading." The younger voice replied, "Do we inform the Commission?" The older voice said, "No. The Commission does not need to know until we have confirmed the activity is sustained. If it is, we initiate Phase 2 containment." The younger voice asked, "What is Phase 2? The older voice said, "Relocation, the same procedure used in 1943. The conversation continued. The older voice described the chamber as active, not in a structural sense, but in an operational one. He used the phrase, "sustained observation protocols," the same language from the 1948 Tisserand letter. He mentioned seismic sensors, real-time monitoring, and a rotating security detail assigned to Sublevel 4, a level I had never been told existed. He said the Church's responsibility was containment, not engagement, and that the phrase on the tablet, "the sky will close," was not a threat to be feared, but a function to be prevented. The recording ended abruptly. I listened to it 4 times. I felt cold, nauseated, vindicated, and terrified. Everything I had suspected was confirmed. The chamber was real. It was being monitored. It was not inert. And the Vatican had been managing this, quietly and continuously, for at least 76 years. M told me she did not know who the voices belonged to. She said she had made the copy because she believed someone, eventually, would ask the right questions. She said she had waited a long time. She asked me what I intended to do. I told her I didn't know yet. She said, "Then decide quickly, because once they know you have this, you will not have time to decide anything." She left. I never saw her again. I still have the recording. In December 2019, I made contact with a theologian and former Jesuit named Father Domenico Lanza. He had left the priesthood in 2005 under disputed circumstances, and now worked as an independent researcher in religious phenomenology. I had found his name in Corey's notes, identified as someone who had unorthodox but informed perspectives on ecclesiastical suppression. I met him in his apartment in Bologna. He was in his 70s, frail but intellectually sharp. I played him the audio recording. I showed him the Censored letter, the 1943 memo, and the photograph of the Proto-Aramaic inscription translation. "The sky will close." He listened, read, and sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "They have misunderstood it, or worse, they have deliberately inverted it." I asked what he meant. He said the phrase, "the sky will close," is not a warning of apocalypse. In Proto-Aramaic eschatological texts, particularly those influenced by Zoroastrian cosmology, the closing of the sky refers to the sealing of divine communication, the severance of humanity's access to higher knowledge. It is not the end of the world, it is the end of revelation. And the ones who close the sky are not demons. They are the custodians of power who fear what revelation would undo. He continued, "The chamber was not a prison for something hostile. It was a sanctuary for something the early church could not tolerate. A source of knowledge, perhaps a text, perhaps a transmission, perhaps even an entity, that contradicted the emerging orthodoxy. The seal was not protective. It was suppressive. And the phrase was not a prophecy. It was an accusation. They were not sealing away evil," Lanza said. "They were sealing away truth. And they have been guarding that seal ever since, because they know that if it is opened, the entire architecture of their authority collapses." I asked if he believed the chamber contained something physical, an object, a text. He said he believed it contained something that could communicate, that had been communicating for millennia, and that the church had spent centuries trying to silence. He said the seismic activity, the sustained observation, the relocation protocols, all of it suggested that whatever was in the chamber was not passive. It was waiting. He said, "The greatest heresy is not to deny God. It is to deny the intermediaries. That is what they fear. That is what they have always feared. Not the loss of faith, but the loss of control over who speaks for the divine." I left Bologna with a different understanding of what I had uncovered. This was not a conspiracy to hide a relic, or suppress a text, or conceal a supernatural threat. This was a theological war that had been fought in silence for 2,000 years, and I had stumbled into its front line. In January 2020, I was summoned to a final meeting at the Vatican. I was not told why. I was not given the option to decline. I was brought to the same unmarked building, the same third-floor room. This time, 2 men were present, a senior official from the Secretariat of State and a legal representative. No cardinal, no ceremony. The official informed me that my contract was being terminated, effective immediately, due to incompatibility with project requirements. I was offered a settlement equivalent to 6 months' salary, conditional on my signature of a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The agreement prohibited me from discussing, publishing, or referencing any findings, observations, or materials related to my work on the St. Peter's project. Violation would result in legal action and financial penalties. I was also informed that all documentation I had produced during my employment, reports, notes, photographs, digital files, was the sole property of the Holy See, and that retention or distribution of such materials constituted theft of proprietary information. I was given 1 hour to consider the terms. I refused to sign. The legal representative said that refusal would result in nullification of my contract without compensation, the formal revocation of my security clearance, and the initiation of an administrative review that would be shared with professional licensing bodies and academic institutions. He said my involvement in the project would be administratively erased, and that any public statements I made would be treated as fabrications by a dismissed contractor with no credible access. He said this without emotion, as though reading from a script. I left the Vatican that afternoon. I was escorted to the gate by 2 uniformed guards. My access badge was confiscated. Within a week, I received notification that my academic references had been contacted by Vatican legal counsel, who informed them that I had been dismissed for professional misconduct and advised them to reconsider their professional associations with me. I lost 2 consulting contracts. A third client delayed payment indefinitely. My reputation, carefully built over 2 decades, was quietly poisoned. I moved out of Italy in March 2020. I now live in Lisbon. I do not use my full name publicly. I do not accept projects involving ecclesiastical architecture. I do not return to Rome. Samuel Khoury was killed in a car accident in Beirut on February 8, 2020. The official report cited brake failure. No mechanical inspection was conducted. His research files were confiscated by Lebanese authorities and later reported lost. Father Lanza died in his sleep in June 2020. The death was ruled natural. He was 73. M has not responded to any of my attempts to contact her. I do not know if she is alive. I am now 49 years old. I work under a consultancy firm registered in Portugal. I do not seek visibility. I do not seek vindication. I seek only to ensure that what I know does not die with me. The structure beneath St. Peter's Basilica remains sealed. The seismic monitoring continues. The rotating security detail remains in place. The church's containment apparatus, refined over centuries, continues to operate with precision, patience, and absolute discretion. They do not destroy evidence. They manage it. They do not silence dissent through violence. They silence it through bureaucracy, reputation, and time. I understand now what I did not understand in 2019. The question is not whether the chamber contains something real. It does. The question is what that reality represents. And the answer, I believe, is this. It represents a version of the sacred that does not require intermediaries. A form of contact, of knowledge, of presence that bypasses the institution entirely. That is the true heresy. That is the unforgivable transgression. The phrase, "the sky will close," was not a warning of cosmic catastrophe. It was a warning that the channels of direct revelation would be severed, and that humanity would be left with only the voice of the institution, claiming to speak for the divine, while ensuring the divine itself could never speak freely. I do not know what is inside the chamber. I do not know if it is an object, a presence, or a transmission encoded in stone. I do know it has been sealed for at least 2 millennia. I know the church has been guarding it, observing it, and relocating it when necessary. I know it is not inert, and I know they are afraid of what would happen if it were opened. This account is my testimony. I have secured copies in multiple locations with instructions for posthumous release. I do not expect justice. I do not expect acknowledgement. I expect only that the truth, once spoken, cannot be fully silenced. The sky has not closed. But there are institutions that spend every resource they possess ensuring it never opens again. And they are still watching. They have always been watching. If you are reading this, I hope you understand. The secrets beneath Rome are not ancient history. They are a present-day operation. And what is being suppressed is not a relic of the past. It is a doorway to a future the institution cannot permit. I have done what I can.